This might not be the Dita you asked for, but I'm gonna tell you right now, this is the Dita that you want. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and well, for about a year now, people have been asking me to review the Dita Project M, and I think I understand why. I actually got a chance to hear it when I was in Shenzhen, China a few months ago, but to be honest, I didn't really like what I heard there at the show, but alongside the Project M, Dita was also showing off this, which is their new Mecha IEM. This is a single dynamic driver IEM that comes in this all titanium shell. In fact, they were really proud of their titanium manufacturing. They had a few different prototypes of it available there. And this is one I heard alongside the Project M, and I just thought this sounded to me a lot better balanced. Project M was pretty bright and aggressive, whereas this, well, let's talk about this one. So for the past couple of weeks, I've been listening to the Dita Mecha, which is, like I mentioned, a single dynamic driver. I haven't mentioned the price yet. As you might expect, with an all titanium shell, it's not cheap at around $900 US, but that puts it in competition with a couple of other fairly pricey single dynamic driver IEMs. And I was curious to find out, does it in long-term listening live up to my positive first impression? And that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get into that, I guess a quick shout out to Dita for sending in the Mecha for review. If you want to check it out, of course, I've got them linked in the description down below. But with that said, let us go back to the table. We're going to talk about the physical form factor, what you get inside the box, packaging, build quality, fit and comfort. Then we'll get into some sound analysis, talking about my sound impressions of this IEM. And then we'll bring in a couple of those other competitor IEMs to give you kind of like a head-to-head direct comparison. And then eventually we'll wrap up this review with a score, as I always do. So with that out of the way, here's the packaging. First of all, I just want to say I actually really like this packaging. It's got this unique kind of lime green color that I feel like it shouldn't be such a striking thing, but there's just something about the simplicity of this packaging and the really nicely executed design on it I like a lot, I'll be honest. And what you get inside the packaging is what you see here. And I'm going to start with actually showing this, which is an interesting little carry case. I usually don't like the carry cases that come in a lot of IEMs just because I tend to use these little plastic boxes myself. But you can see this is a little plastic box, and so in some ways this is actually closer to something that I might use. Now it's an interesting design. This, in fact, I don't know if this is like a handle. It's kind of hard to get up, but it is possible to flip this thing up. Well, trust me, bro. But otherwise, there's like a locking mechanism here in the front. You can flip that up, and then you have access to the interior where you've actually got a somewhat soft touch kind of silicone padding on the inside. And I don't know, it's a very interesting design. It's kind of cool to see them use something that's not what you see typically with other IEMs. And it also seems like it's stackable. And for me, that's actually pretty cool. That's actually why I like those little plastic boxes. They're stackable. But apart from that stuff, of course, you get ear tips. And well, there's a couple of interesting notes on these ear tips. So for one, it comes with one set of ear tips pre-installed, and then it comes with this box of an alternative set of ear tips. What's interesting is that these are all final E-type ear tips. However, the set that's pre-installed is their E-type TWS ear tips. And it only comes in this one size, which I believe is their medium size. And then these over here are just their normal final E-type ear tips, which might be subtle, but they are actually a pretty distinctly different shape. You can see the TWS tips are a little bit on the shorter side, and they're also, oops, I just dropped it, they're also a little bit narrower in bore. I know this pretty well because the final E-type tips are things that I've bought a lot of. These are generally nice premium tips. They've got a nice tacky material to them, really nice silicone. And I guess I'm just a little bit confused why they only gave you one size of the TWS tips, but I did find that those actually worked out really well for me, so I guess I shouldn't complain. One other interesting note about these ear tips is this might not be obvious to you, and again, as a self-professed final E-type aficionado, I kind of recognize these right away. These are glow-in-the-dark ear tips, okay? Here, let me demonstrate for you, all right? I'm gonna turn off my lights. And okay, you might not be able to totally tell that they're glowing in the dark, but I've got a little black light here. So I'm basically going to supercharge them, and then I'm going to turn off the black light, and you're going to see that they're glowing. That's a kind of a weird inclusion, but I kind of like it. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it goes well with the lime green box. I don't know if that's the intention or not, but nonetheless, it is kind of a cool little addition, and it's certainly nice build quality and material in these tips. I also like the little carry case that it comes with, kind of reminiscent of the carry case that you get over here. But apart from this stuff, let's get into the build quality of the IEM. There are a couple of related accessories that we're going to talk about, which is this. So it comes on a cable, of course, and this cable does have a swappable termination. And the mechanism on this is nice. It's got a little screw-on retention here, and you pull this thing off, and you can replace it with, so I've got the standard 3.5 mil termination on here. It also comes with a 4.4 mil balance connector, if that's what you prefer. But they also include, and I think this is really cool, a USB connector. So if you are plugging this thing into a phone that doesn't have a headphone jack, well, they've got you covered here. And basically, if you're not aware of how this kind of thing works, there's actually like a micro DAC and amplifier built into just this really small component. And I think that is a cool touch. That's something that Dunu's been doing for a while, but they don't even include it with their IEMs. You have to buy that extra. So that's pretty cool to see that Dita's doing that and including it with their IEMs. But that will lead us into talking about the rest of this cable. And here's where I'll probably get a little bit picky. I think the cable is interesting. Here, let me punch in on that so you can kind of take a look at it. It's very much thick, but it kind of reminds me of like the Hyphaman catheter cable. It's a little bit on the thick side, but it's also, because of that, a little bit stiff and a little bit memory prone. I don't know how much this is going to come across, so definitely not at all if I cover up the camera. But you can see it kind of wants to coil itself back together, and that's just kind of been the case for as long as I've had this IEM. It does, it Rhody wraps well, and I'll show you what it looks like. Obviously it will sit nicely on a table. It will sit inside my boxes quite well, but when you're wearing it, you are aware that it is a little bit on the springy side and a little bit stiff. So a little bit of a downside there. The other complaints that I have about this cable, actually maybe just one complaint, is you got a nice small Y split. I appreciate that, but there is no chin slider whatsoever to speak of. So if you want a chin slider, you're going to have to bring your own. You have to figure out how to install one. But otherwise, up top, of course, you've got your standard preformed ear hooks, and they terminate in your standard 2-pin connector. Now the connector here on the IEM is not recessed in any way, and so because of that, there's no protrusion here, and you do get a nice flush fit. And you can see that it's got this little angled fit to it, which I think is a nice touch. I usually like 2-pin connectors when they do that. Other than that, I guess that will bring us into talking about the earpieces themselves, which are, I think, pretty stinking handsome. Again, they are an all titanium shell, and I think that's kind of neat. The weight on them, however, as you might expect for a solid metal shell, is, it's a little bit on the hefty side. I didn't weigh them, I probably should have, but I would guess that combined these probably weigh within the vicinity of like 15 to 20 grams, which is not super heavy, but it is definitely not a lightweight IEM. Other things that are notable about these shells is, well, the shape of it is pretty unique. In fact, it looks a little bit on the chonky side. I'll give you a fit demonstration in a little bit though, because what's interesting is that as chonky as these things look, especially like you see like the distance between the outside here to the ear tip, like that's a lot of girth. In the ear, it doesn't actually feel that big, which is kind of interesting. I guess on the note of bigness, we can talk about this nozzle. So I'll pull off the ear tip so you can take a look at the nozzle. I believe I measured this at just under 6 millimeters before, but let me give it a live measurement here for y'all to behold. Yeah, about 5.9 millimeters in diameter here for the nozzle, which is not a super thin nozzle, but anything under 6 millimeters, I think most people are not going to have an issue with, but hopefully you have enough context for yourself to know whether or not that is an issue. For me, it wasn't an issue. I like the nozzle entrance in my ear canal was perfectly satisfactory. But I guess we can get into talking about how this thing fits in my ear by giving you the close-up demonstration. So yeah, like I mentioned, it does look a little bit chonky, but surprisingly, it just kind of slots in quite well. I would describe this as probably like a medium-large fitting IEM, but it doesn't exert pressure on the outside of my conch or anything like that. It just kind of snugs in quite nice, and fit stability on it is better than your average single dynamic driver IEM because it does have kind of that opinionated shape. Where is it down here? I'll hold it up for you. It's got that, it's got a little bit of a wing on it, and because of that, it snugs in quite well. There is one downside, however, to fitting this IEM, and I'm aware of it here as I'm plugging it into my ears, there is pretty significant driver crinkle as I plug it in and create a seal. It's interesting because there is actually a vent on both the outside of the volume here as well as on the interior of the volume. So it is vented in both directions, but nonetheless, I am still getting a little bit of that driver crinkle. I only get that when I first put it in my ears, and to be honest, like I kind of forgot about it, but nonetheless, if that's a thing that bothers you, and frankly, it is a thing that can bother me, do be aware that does happen. But apart from that, let me just check my notes. I don't think there's anything else I need to talk about physical form factor, so we could probably get into talking about the sound, but let me wrap this guy up, make it presentable. See, I told you it Rode wraps well. And let's move on to the sound signature here of the Dita Mecha. All right, so here's the frequency response that I've measured of this IEM. If you want to check it out for yourself, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below, but let's do a little bit of analysis together. So what to expect of the Mecha? I think this frequency response should give you a pretty good sense of it, but there's a couple of things that are actually a little bit, I found surprising, things that sounded different than what I expected versus this measurement, okay? Let's start with the thing that is very much clear. This is kind of a version of a V-shaped sound signature. It's got a very hefty bass boost with a little bit of vocal forwardness up here as well. And this might not be totally apparent. It's a little bit hard to tell sometimes with treble measurements on our rigs. But I would say that the treble on this IEM is actually a little bit on the tame side. It's a little bit on the reserved side, but it nonetheless doesn't come across as like overly stuffy or muddy, because I think that this little bit of extra vocal presence is still giving it enough of that contrast to give it that strong V-shaped definition, while still definitely being more warm leaning and bass focused. The thing that I found really the most surprising, and I'm not going to pull this up right now because I think the IEM is in a lot of ways a bit of a distraction right now, but this reminds me of frequency response wise, you lay it over the top of something like the Tantrum Oxygen or the Tantrum Hada 2021, and they align a lot. And this is where I'm going to get into like where they sound quite a bit different to me actually though, is I pulled out the Tantrum 2021 and compared it with the Dita, the Mecha just sounds a lot warmer. The Tantrum sounds a lot brighter, and not that that is a particularly bright IEM, but just to give you context into what the Mecha sounds like is very much a warm, kind of laid back, bass forward sound signature. And I think that's generally what you should expect from this. But let's get into some of my more subjective impressions of the sound, as if that wasn't subjective. But let's get more into the details, all right? So as I mentioned, the bass is definitely the standout character of the sound here. Not only because there's a lot of bass, but because the bass is actually really fun. That was the part that I heard in Shenzhen that I was like, ooh, that's kind of nice. I like that. It's got a nice warmth, it's got a nice body, and especially it's got a really nice impact. So if you're listening to music, say classic rock, stuff that has, prominent kick drums and stuff in it, it's going to come across with a nice, satisfying wallop, and I appreciate that. It also gives it a nice sense of depth, and generally just like the definition on the attack on the bass is quite nice. It's not necessarily like the most textured of sub-bass presentations, so if you're looking at something like really trying to follow a tight sub-bass line, it can do it. It can definitely pull it off, but it's not going to be where it stands out so much, nearly as much as in that, again, that kind of wallop that you get from things like kick drums. In terms of like clarity and image separation, I would say it's kind of on the average side, to be honest. It gives you maybe more of a cohesive sound, but it doesn't really give you that strong separation between instruments as you're listening to, let's say, a busy track. Something like The Cure's Close Down is a good example I use a lot of the times. It's just got a lot of stuff going on at the same time, including some mid-bass kick drums kind of going on through it. And the drums can be fun to follow, but the separation here on the Mecha is not super strong. It's just not really where this thing is indexing for. What is positive though is I'll say that the upper treble I mentioned is a little bit on the reserve side, right? This is not a trebly V-shaped sound signature. It's a little bit on the relaxed side and comfortable side. It still does a pretty good job with high frequency percussion. Probably not the best, but it still does a pretty good job. Like everything sounds natural. Cymbals and hi-hats will sound metallic rather than just plasticky, but it doesn't have quite the exaggerated zing of some other IEMs. And for people who are sensitive to that kind of thing, that might actually be a benefit for you. For me, I would say I could do with a little bit more upper treble in this IEM. I think it would help with the contrast and probably help with the spatial effects, but as it is, it's still a very satisfying sound. Let me bring in a couple of other IEMs for comparison, as I've already alluded to earlier in this video. Let's start with this one. This is the Dunu Zen Pro. It's actually been a while since this one came out. This is a single dynamic driver IEM. I believe price on this thing is also around $900 US. If it's even still available for sale, I don't know. It's been a while since this guy came out. But tuning wise, I think this is an interesting comparison because again, price wise, dynamic driver-ish, but they're actually pretty different in terms of sound signature, but there is one characteristic that they share in common. Tuning wise, I'm going to say that the Zen Pro is a lot more mid-range focused. It does have a little bit more treble energy, but it's not really a bright trebly set. It's just kind of a more, still kind of a warm mid-range sound, but it's more mid-range focused. And so vocals are going to come across a little bit clearer, a little bit more emphasis, and the bass is going to take a backseat to those. But that's not to say that the bass is not a significant part of the Zen Pro, because that was the part that I think these things actually share in common. And it's interesting because they are such different approaches on the tuning, but they both have a really nice, satisfying bass wallop. Again, that word that I hope means something to somebody else out there. Just thinking about like kind of that physicality and that impact and that slam behind a kick drum. Both of these do a really good job. Now, definitely you're going to get more of it over here on the Mecha, but if you're looking for something that is more mid-range tune, a little bit closer to something that's neutral, but still gives you that bass wallop, I think the Zen Pro does a pretty good job of it. Let me check my notes if there's anything else. I mean, I think, again, just the mid-range focus tuning of the Zen Pro is going to mean that vocals are going to come through more clear. You're going to get more of that micro contrast and vocal nuance, which is personally what I over-index for. Like that's the sound that I want out of my IEMs. The Mecha is, again, it's going to be more in the bass focus. And when that's what I'm in the mood for, it's a lot of fun. But overall, I would say I probably would still lean toward the Zen Pro for my personal preferences. But then one other comparison, and this one I'm pretty certain is still available, another single dynamic driver. Price on this one, I don't know, Sennheiser's nuts. Their pricing is always crazy, but somewhere between $500 and $800. I feel like the MSRP on this thing shifts all the time. But let's call it $700 because I think that's what I paid for the IE600. They take very interesting, different approaches to a number of things, but what's, I guess, similar, right? They're both single dynamic driver IEMs. They both come in these little metal shells. They both even kind of look like roughly the same color, although, of course, over here we've got titanium, whereas the IE600 is made of like some 3D printed zirconium or something like that. I don't know. Maybe that's just Sennheiser marketing speak, but it is an interesting build quality. It's just a lot smaller. And I believe the dynamic driver inside of it is also a lot smaller. Now, that's not the only thing that is different. The tonality, the tuning, and the technical performance are just kind of, I don't want to say polar opposites, but they are just very, very different. They're both like V-shaped sound signatures. And that's why I probably shouldn't say they're polar opposites, but you listen to them back to back. This is like a bass forward V-shaped sound signature. This is more of a treble forward V-shaped sound signature. And for me, I actually end up preferring the IE600 just because like the bite, the attack, and the definition, the incisiveness on everything just comes across a lot cleaner and a lot sharper. And because of that also, I think the imaging performance is a little bit stronger here on the IE600. So I just mean separation between sounds and kind of the relative position of those things and kind of a 3D field inside your head, depending on the music you're listening to. If you're listening to flat music, none of this really matters. But if you're listening to good music, that kind of stuff can stand out. Now, the bass performance is where they're quite different. The IE600 is mostly a sub-bass focused IEM. So it's really articulate and it's good at following those nuanced sub-bass tones. But it doesn't quite give you that same wallop and that same like satisfying depth that you get with the bass hits on the Dita Mecha. So I think these IEMs are going to appeal to different people depending on what you're going after. Are you looking for something that has really nice bass, but really it's all about kind of the imaging and the treble performance on the IE600? Or are you going for something that's a little bit more relaxed, actually quite a bit more relaxed, and is going to give you more of that satisfying warmth from the low-end wallop? That's what you're going to get here with the Dita Mecha. Let me just check my notes, see if there's anything else. I mean, just overall, like I would say the IE600 does come across as like a thinner sound in terms of that V-shaped sound signature. It is a more aggressive, engaging sound because of that, but it can also maybe be a little bit too aggressive and too engaging. I'll just, a fair warning, this is an IEM that has broken many of people because of the treble performance on it. For me, I think it's very important just to fine tune the tips. And for me, I was able to get this thing dialed in quite well. And if that doesn't sound like something that you're into, the Dita Project, not the Project M, the Mecha might actually be the better choice. So I think that's gonna do it for my review here on the Dita Mecha. Let me just check my notes, make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, I think out of 5 stars, look, I guess maybe answering the question, does this live up to my listening impressions when I heard this thing in Shenzhen? I think the answer is yes. Look, I knew when I listened to it in Shenzhen, it wasn't like my ideal sound signature. It's definitely a bass forward execution that is maybe not quite doing what I'm looking for out of my absolute favorite IEMs, but it's a very satisfying sound. Out of 5 stars, I'm gonna give this guy a very solid 3 stars out of 5. I think it competes with other IEMs in its price range. Although if you're just after the sound, you might be able to get a comparable sound at a lesser price, but are you gonna get an all titanium shell? Is that something you care about? If it is something you care about, you're probably not gonna get it for much less. So if you're interested in checking out the Dita Mecha, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you have not already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, which I've also got linked in the description down below. And I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit.